but I'll give the next question here. This one comes from Doug Jefferson, who's the vice president of the National African American Gun Association. And he asks, what efforts, if any, have you seen regarding strengthening enforcement of current laws and processes that could prevent tragedies like what occurred in Buffalo? For example, in both Charleston and San Antonio church shootings, the assailants were able to legally purchase firearms because disqualifying factors had not been properly reported, resulting in charges not showing up on their background checks. Right. So this goes hand in hand with what we were just talking about, right?
Right.
One of the things that's key in these situations is that, like, you can talk about red flag laws and we can debate the drawbacks and the positives of them, and you could make a case for how they should have been employed in, at the very least, the Buffalo shooting, potentially the elementary school shooting, given there were reports that he was cutting himself and was, had domestic violence threats and, some other warning signs for this attack. But the bottom line is, if nobody does anything about that, it doesn't really matter what laws you have in place.
Right.
Right. So the key here is people have to be willing to actually say something and actually file, police have to be willing to file charges. But of course, there's drawbacks to that approach too, because oftentimes the reason you wouldn't get serious charges is because the idea is to not ruin someone's life over a single incident or something like that. And so there's obviously trade-offs to extremely strict, no exceptions enforcement of things. That, the elementary school shooter, right? He had told a friend that he had showed up and a friend saw that he was cutting himself or had cuts on his face. He said he did it himself. That friend probably should have intervened in some way, reported it to school officials or whatever might have been the case. But, you're talking about somebody who's also a kid, and putting that responsibility on them.
Yeah.
And it's difficult. It's easy to look back in hindsight and say, well, there's these warning signs. And sometimes they are very bright warning signs.
Right.
They're very red flags. Like Parkland had multiple incidents. A lot of these guys have multiple incidents. And so if somebody at some point would do something like it makes sense. But at the same time, it's easy to look back with 2020 vision and say, well, we know of this one incident that is a warning sign. He should have been committed or arrested or charged on based on this. When in real life, people aren't, often going to be given the harshest punishments for a first offense.
Right.
or a first warning sign. Does not, because most of the time that doesn't mean that you're going to actually, it's such a small likelihood that somebody who has a particular warning sign is going to actually end up being a mass killer.
Right.
That it's one thing you have to keep in mind is that when you're saying we need to fully prosecute every warning sign or push it to the very most severe reaction to every red flag or warning sign, you're talking about doing that to millions of people who are not going to end up committing any kind of violent crime, let alone a mass killing. So this is one of the things that I think people have to keep in mind. There's trade-offs to all of this. But I don't know. I don't want to get too pessimistic about it, right? And say there's not. I don't like saying there's nothing that can be done, or these are inevitable, or there's no way we could reduce this. I just want people to understand that it's not. There isn't one magic trick like you see in the viral ads, right?
Yeah.
That's just going to fix all this. There's trade-offs to all of these things, and you have to be able to understand those trade-offs and make the calculation of whether or not you're willing to make those trade-offs. I guess is my point.
I think that's a huge point, because he brings up, for example, things like the Charleston or the San Antonio shooting, or even Parkland that you brought up, where, yeah, there's recurring indicators in these people's past. In the cases of Charleston and San Antonio, there were actual disqualifying according to the 4473 events that happened in this past. But in order to make sure that, that safety net catches those disqualifying events, you would have to be willing to enable a lot more law enforcement sharing of information, much more bureaucratic sharing of information. And, that it's kind of interesting how this can kind of cross-cut different ways politically, where folks who may not be so keen on maybe boosting law enforcement's ability to monitor more things are also looking for more solutions to stop these mass shootings. And so the trade-offs thing is key here, where you have to weigh the interests. Do we think this is going to help prevent these shootings? Are we willing to give up, privacy or whatever your concern may be, in order to make that happen? So that's why he asked if there's any efforts that we've seen. You see it get talked about, but I don't think there's been any real effort, because these trade-offs are hard, as you said. And we, like you said, we don't want to be pessimistic, but these are real trade-offs to consider.
Yeah.
And that's why we are where we are.
Yeah. I mean, I wish there was an easy solution to everything, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we all wish there was, and that's why people gravitate towards somebody telling them there is an easy solution, right? Just ban all the guns. Well, look, even if you banned all new gun sales tomorrow, you still have so many firearms in the United States that it's not going to, trying to use ban all guns as a solution to mass shootings is, the most broad possible policy you could come up with. Just make sure no one can own guns, because there are a very small number of people who will carry out, a sort of a mass attack like this with them. Of course, we still see mass killings, even mass shootings in other countries that have total gun bans. This is not something that never happens anywhere else, as much as that, might be a talking point. You do see these events all over the world. Whether they're more frequent in the United States is obviously something that is potentially the case, but there's also been dispute. There's was 2018 study that concluded they aren't more frequent in the United States. These are rare events statistically. Of course, nobody wants to hear that in the immediate aftermath of 19 children being murdered, because everyone cares more about never having it happen at all. But and which is an absolutely reasonable response to a slaughter like that, and makes it difficult to. That's the thing, is the natural, understandable response to something like this is very emotional, because it's such a horrific event. But and so it makes it difficult to say, well, let's step back and look at the statistics on this, right? And this is actually fairly rare. It's only the third, mass shooting of the year, or where for mass shooting being 4 more people killed in a single incident like this. But it's that's not going to win over a lot of people when you start talking about it, just because this is such a horrible event that everyone wants it to be 0 times. And so people are willing to consider all sorts of solutions, and they're willing to listen to people who will tell them that there's an easy fix, even if there isn't.
Yeah.
And so that's I think that's perhaps the driving point of my whole overarching thought here that I keep coming back to, I suppose, is just there are things that can be done. I believe that there are things that can be done to reduce the number of these events and try and stop people who show warning signs that they're going to happen, that they're going to carry something like this out. But I just go back to there isn't going to be one single thing that fixes everything.